this is on. Okay. All right. Maybe go ahead and open up to Romans chapter 14. Romans 14. We'll get to it here in just a moment. Hoping we can get through this evening. I think we'll go through it pretty fast. And then next week we're willing to get to move on into the next church period or church age, and then finish up in a few weeks. That's the goal. Goals are good. Gives you something to shoot for and something to miss. So let's go ahead and pray, and we'll get started. Father, thank you for your goodness to us and the safety to gather together this evening. I pray that you bless our time. Pray that you would work in our hearts. And Lord, pray that you help us have a better appreciation for the sacrifices of those that went before us to establish the freedoms, the liberties that we have in this country. Thank you for your goodness to us. Thank you for making us citizens of this land, despite its imperfections, still the best place in the world to live. I pray that you would bless our time together. In Jesus' name, amen. So, kind of what we're going to do here is we're going to turn our focus to America a little bit here and the involvement that Baptists had in the Revolution, the establishment of the Bill of Rights, and just to help us understand that a little bit, because that's a part of history, American history, that most people don't get unless you really go looking for it, and you wouldn't know to go looking for it unless somebody told you about it. So it's just one of those things. So we're going to look at that a little bit, and one of the reasons we want to focus on this, because as we're looking at this Philadelphia period of church history, it's the period of the expansion of the gospel and the great missions movements. As we think about America, has America been important in missions? Absolutely, it has been. America has been the number one sender of missionaries around the world up until like the last 30 years, and now there's more missionaries coming off the field than there are going to the field, and missionaries are being sent to America from the Philippines. That's just such a wonderful testimony, isn't it? So that's our condition now, but America has not always been that way. America has always been one of the greatest promoters of the cause of Christ in all of the world. In fact, our founders believe that was one of the purposes God was establishing this country. And so the liberties that we have was mainly for that purpose. So now, last week we finished up talking about the Separate Baptist Revival. So the Separate Baptist Revival takes place about the time of the Great Awakening. And as a result of that Separate Baptist Revival, Baptist principles and the gospel are beginning to spread throughout the South, creating the Bible Belt. And the reason this was a better revival than even the Great Awakening is because it was biblical, it was long-lasting. And the reason it was biblical, it was more biblical, was because they're not just preaching the gospel. What else are they doing? They're baptizing their converts, and they're establishing churches, Bible-believing churches, in which it's only saved, baptized people who are the members, and they're preaching the Bible to them. And they're establishing them in the truths of God's Word. And so as they do that, this then teaches those people to go out and to preach the gospel, just as we see in the Great Commission, just as we see being followed in the book of Acts. And these churches are beginning to spread throughout the South. They're coming north as far up into Virginia especially, even into New York. They're also going west as far as the Mississippi River. And they're just going all over the place. And Virginia especially, we're going to talk about quite a bit this evening, because that's really where the Bill of Rights was secured for us. It was the Baptists of Virginia that secured that. But when we look at this, couple principles in particular are being promoted by Baptists. Number one being the separation of church and state. Okay, this is a big deal for Baptists. The church doesn't control the state doesn't control the church. The purpose of the state, according to Romans 13, is to reward the good, punish the evil, and enforce a peaceable society. Create and enforce laws that allow us as citizens to live out the liberties that God has given us. That's the purpose of government. And when those liberties are being infringed upon, then it's the responsibility of the government to step in and say, no, it's not okay to do. Another principle is this principle of individual soul liberty. Okay, so here in Romans 14, this is kind of where I guess you could say the beachhead for this principle would be. So notice verse 1 here, him that is weak in the faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. For one believeth that he may eat all things, another who is weak eateth herbs. Let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him which eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. Who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth. Yea, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. One man esteemeth one day above another. Another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. So as we think about the idea of individual soul liberty, okay, this is one of our Baptist principles. The basic idea is you have a right to worship God or to not worship God. But that doesn't mean it's okay to not worship God. It doesn't mean that there's no consequences for our beliefs. It's just I don't have the right to enforce or to push necessarily my beliefs upon you. I don't have a right to persecute you because you don't agree with me. It's okay you don't agree with me. Now, we can be okay if we disagree, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one or either of us are okay with God, because one or both of us could be wrong, right? And if we're wrong, then we're going to be in trouble with God. God's the only one that can actually do that judging and pass that judgment. We don't have that right to do that. So this is something that's going to become a big deal because within the colonies, what's the problem in the colonies? These Puritans, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Congregationalists, they leave England in search of religious liberty because they want to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. And now what happens when they get here? They establish state church colonies, essentially, with established churches, and if you disagree with them, what's going to happen? You're going to be beaten, killed, or disenfranchised, and kicked out of society, fed to the wolves, basically, and have to deal with the Indians on your own. So they've done the exact same thing. Why? It's because they don't have the biblical principle of individual soul liberty. They want that for themselves. I mean, who wouldn't if you're being persecuted? But if it's not a religious conviction, then you have a problem. And so they begin to establish these state churches, so to speak. And so this is becoming an issue. Now, as a result of the separate Baptist revival, though, and the spread of Baptist principles, many hundreds of thousands of people within the colonies are becoming Baptist. And it's taking over. A lot of people really are not liking it, especially in Virginia early on. In Virginia, they did not like the Baptists early on. In fact, the ministers of those churches began referring to Baptist pastors as magicians and wizards and different things like that, saying that they cast spells upon people. Really, they're just persuasive, I guess, in what they're saying. They actually believe what they're saying. And so this is beginning to happen. And so as these principles begin to go out, as people are being converted to Christ, as biblical churches are being established, as people are learning to live by God's word, the colonies are beginning to experience tremendous blessings, and this is also beginning to lay a foundation now for the blessings that you and I get to reap today as a result of being an American. It comes from these people. So now, let's consider this. So in the lead up to the Revolution, okay, that's what we want to look at. The lead up to the Revolution, the states, the colonies initially have been granted charters from the crown to self-govern, okay? So a little while before the Revolution, so we're looking at let me see here what I got in my notes, because I have a little bit different notes than you do. So pre-1754, the states, initially, the colonies, have the complete right to self-government. They have individual charters, colonial charters, to self-govern. So they can establish their own taxes of their citizens, they can establish their own governments, they can establish their own democracies and republics, and that's what they have going on here in the colonies. Now the problem is there's a problem with the French and the Indians up north. You know, those Canadian people. There's a bit of an issue going on here. And George Washington, as the general of the colonial army, is having a meeting with one of the Indian chiefs and the French. But there's a problem. The translator for George Washington is Dutch, and there's a mistranslation of some things that are said, and so George Washington wrongly orders the execution of the Indian chief. And so this is going to spark the French and Indian War. And as a result of that, once Britain finds out what's going on, and this is a lot of dirt on Britain, because now not only is it a problem with the Indians, which Britain's not overly concerned about, but it's also a problem now with the French. So this is becoming a global issue, and so Britain, the king, sends troops over, and they're going to tighten the reins on the people of the colonies. And they're going to forget about the fact that they gave them charters to self-govern, and now they're going to come and impose high taxes, and they're going to bring in their military to enforce martial law, essentially, on the colonies. And so they're going to lose their rights. Now in 1689, the crown lost a lot of power because you had the Magna Carta a few hundred years before, and then kind of working up, you have different things. So a Bill of Rights is passed in England establishing the rights of freemen within England. And this is what they have been operating under in the colonies. But now once these soldiers come over and Britain begins to tighten down the reins of power upon the colonies, the citizens begin to lose their rights of freemen. So among these rights that they had was taxation with representation. They had property rights. So I have the right to my property. You don't have the right to search and seizure. You know, very similar to some of the things in our Bill of Rights. You know, laws against cruel and unusual punishment, various things like that. But once the soldiers from Britain start coming over, that's all going to go away. Now, Britain's going to impose taxes upon the colonies. Anything we send you, you have to buy it, and we're going to tax you through the roof. We're going to tax you an arm and a leg. Well, they didn't like that. Then, if the soldiers want to come into your house and eat a meal, you just have to let them come in. They can just barge in, take whatever they want, use whatever they want. They can spend the night. They can set up camp in your yard, whatever you want, and that's totally fine. You have to let them do that. If they want to, get inappropriate, wild, that's fine. There's nothing you can do about that. And so the colonists, this is not okay. So as this begins to happen, and so let's look at your blank here, that second paragraph. As a result of this war, Britain once again attempted to take the reins of power from the Americans and fill their coffers by the increase of taxes. Now, as this begins to happen, the issue is not a matter of if we go to war, but when. This has been the idea since not long after the French and Indian War. Washington especially, because as a result of that, as troops are coming over from Britain, they have new soldiers, new troops, green behind the gills, so to speak, and they have more authority because they're from Britain than even General Washington himself had. And so he resigns his position, but he offers his assistance free of charge to one of the colonels of the British troops. So he's able to get in and kind of get all this inside information, which is going to help out quite a bit later. Now let's notice here. So the following here is from the North Carolina History Project, and this is not a Christian site. This is just a regular history site, and this is what they say. During the mid to late 1760s, the British government started tightening its regulatory grip on the American colonies, and in return, Americans started boycotting the importation of English goods. In Virginia, large planters, including Richard Henry Lee and George Mason, once again declared that Virginia had an exclusive power to tax its citizens. So this is the idea of taxation with representation. England doesn't have the right to tax us. You gave us a charter to govern ourselves, and we alone have the right to tax our citizens and nobody else. Nobody else can tax us. We don't tax anybody else. We tax our citizens. And they pledged to boycott all British goods that were taxed, except for paper. In Charleston, South Carolina, defenders of economic liberty met under the Liberty Tree. Under its shade, they pledged to buy no British goods and no slaves from British traders. When the government continued trampling on what they considered their English rights, North Carolinians, anyway, people from North Carolina, in the end, took matters in their own hands, and I would expect no less from people in North Carolina. Now, on November 2nd, 1769, this would be Speaker of the House, Harvey, presented the Virginia Resolution of non-importation to North Carolina legislature, and when the lower house adopted the resolution, Governor Tryon dissolved the assembly. So here you have Governor Tryon, he's a British governor, and so he's here to enforce British law. This man is a tyrant. And so what he does is once they declare self-rule, once they say, no, we're not going to take any imports from Britain or anything like that, Governor Tryon comes and says, okay, I'm dissolving the assembly. These are the representatives of the people. These are the people that are making the self-governing people. I'm dissolving it. So he's taking full control here. Now, Tryon became the governor of North Carolina in May 1765. From the beginning, he proved to be an enemy of liberty, self-rule, and the Baptist. He had a corrupt group of politicians under him who pocketed half the taxes. According to historian Pascal, or whatever his name is, Tryon called the Baptists enemies of society and the scandal to common sense. I think they call us that today too, or something similar, maybe not quite as nice as that. But now, I want you to notice here, because this is a separation of church and state issue that comes about. 1766, he passed a marriage act that put Baptists and other dissenters on the wrong side of the law if they performed weddings. So here's what he does. Tryon comes in and he says that the only recognizable marriages are those that are performed by state-licensed churches and state-licensed ministers. Now, Baptists, do they accept a license from the state? Does the state give them the authority to preach the gospel? No. That authority comes alone from Jesus Christ. So Baptists have never taken a license from the state to do weddings, to preach, to do any of this stuff. That the state doesn't have any say on that whatsoever. And so Tryon comes in and he says, now, if you have a wedding that's not performed by a state official, then it's not a legitimate wedding. So now the Baptists, they don't care what he says. They're going to continue to perform weddings. But the problem is now, any weddings that were performed previous and any weddings that they perform after are considered by the state now to be fornication. The state won't recognize them as being married. The state recognizes them as just shacking up. So now, if they continue to do this, they're in trouble. And the people that are getting married, not recognized by the state, well, they're in trouble by the state because at that time, they have laws against fornication and shacking up. So this becomes a really big problem. Does the government have the right to define or redefine marriage? That's an issue we're facing in our day, isn't it? Government trying to do the exact same thing. Now, it's on a different level, yes, but it's the exact same principle. Government only has the right to recognize what God has created. That's what they do, and they're to put a fence around that and protect that as God's creation. They don't have the right to define that. They don't make it. They don't have the right to define it. Only God has that. Now, because of the corruption and mistreatment of Baptists and other dissenters, lack of representation and high taxes, the Baptists led in a liberty movement. These lovers of liberty would be called the regulators. And the regulators, here's your blank, were largely Baptists. The Baptists are going to become some of the key people in the war. Benjamin Merrill was a key leader in the movement. He was a member of the Jersey Settlement Baptist Church, where John Gano where John Gano pastored, and John Gano is going to become significant because he is going to be the chaplain for George Washington during the Revolutionary War, and he's actually going to baptize George Washington near the end of the war, which I find fascinating. Now, on May 16, 1771, Governor Tryon and his army met the regulators near Alamance Creek. In less than 2 hours, Tryon's army decimated the regulators. So the regulators are basically militia, is what they are. After Alamance, Merrill and 5 others were hanged at Hillsborough. Chief Justice Howard pronounced the following sentence. So this is Tryon's Chief Justice, and this is what he says. Consider how nice and godly and Christian these men are. That you, Benjamin Merrill, being carried to the place from whence you came, that you be drawn from thence to the place of execution, where you are to be hanged by the neck, that you be cut down while yet alive, that your bowels be taken out and burned before your face, that your head be cut off, your body divided into 4 quarters, and this to be at his majesty's disposal, and the Lord have mercy on your soul. So now when the Bill of Rights comes about and we want laws protecting us from cruel and unusual punishment, this is why. That's a little excessive. I mean, I guess I could understand the hanging aspect. If you're a government and you're considering this anarchy, I guess I could see, okay, hang the guy. Not that I think they're right in doing it, but here in this instance, but I can understand that. But then, before the person's dead, cut him down, slit his belly open while he's alive and awake, and then burn his bowels in front of him. And then after he's dead, we're going to cut his head off, quarter his body, and that might be a little bit more of punishment than what's needed. And so the spark created from this battle would eventually ignite the fire of revolution. Tryon and his militia knew the regulators were mostly Baptists, so he attacked, now notice this, Sandy Creek, that's where the separate Baptist revival began, was a Sandy Creek, Abbott's Creek, Shallow Fords, Deep Creek, and others. Now, I want you to notice here, where are all these Baptist churches? They're in places where there's bodies of water. Why is that significant? What does a Baptist church need a body of water for? To baptize people. So they conveniently put their churches next to bodies of water. Now, it needs to be remembered that Baptist principles of liberty and limited government fueled the revolution. The demand for liberty was strong long before the revolution. And then Cathcart, he's a Baptist historian, stated the following. Now, just before we get here, remember we talked about this just a moment ago, pastors, even in the colonies, where they're having these establishment churches, pastors were required to receive a license from the state in order to minister the gospel. Well, Baptists were not going to do that. And so here's an instance where 3 men are arrested, Baptists are arrested, and they're brought to court. And I'm going to read the court proceedings to you. It actually was a very fast court case, and a very significant character, person of interest in American history, is the one who defended them. So in June 1768, John Waller, Lewis Craig, and James Childs, 3 Baptist ministers, were arrested in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, on the charge of preaching the gospel contrary to the law, so the law being that they were not licensed. "May it please your worships," said the prosecuting attorney, "they cannot meet a man on the road without ramming a text of Scripture down his throat." Sounds about like Baptist, doesn't it? On refusing to pledge themselves to stop preaching in the county for a year and a day, they were forthwith ordered to prison. Now, what I want to do is I want to read to you the proceedings, and it's on the last page there of your notes. It's rather interesting. And so this is a description of the defense of John Waller, Lewis Craig, and James Childs in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, on June 4, 1768. They were dragged before the magistrates and indicted as disturbers of the peace because of their preaching. This action, with others similar, aroused the sympathy and aid of the renowned Patrick Henry, who decided to defend these innocent men and aid in their acquittal. The following is a description of what happened. 3 Baptist preachers were brought to the trial for preaching. The indictment brought against them was for preaching the gospel of the Son of God, contrary to the statute in the case provided, and therefore disturbers of the peace. The clerk was reading the indictment in a slow and formal manner, and he pronounced the crime with emphasis, for preaching the gospel of the Son of God, when a plain-dressed man dismounted his horse, entered the courthouse, and took his seat within the bar. He was known to the court and lawyers, but a stranger to the mass of spectators who had gathered on the occasion. This was Patrick Henry, who, on hearing of this prosecution, had rode some 50 or 60 miles from his residence in Hanover County to volunteer his services in the defense of the prisoners. He listened to the further reading of the indictment with marked attention, the first sentence of which that had caught his ear was for preaching the gospel of the Son of God. When the indictment had been read, and the prosecuting attorney had submitted a few remarks, Henry arose, stretched out his hand, received the paper, and then addressed the court. "May it please your worships, I think I heard read by the prosecutor as I entered this house the paper I now hold in my hand. If I have rightly understood, the king's attorney of this colony has framed an indictment for the purpose of arraigning and punishing by imprisonment inoffensive persons before the bar of this court for a crime of great magnitude as disturbers of the peace. May it please the court, what did I hear read? Did I hear it distinctly, or was it a mistake of my own? Did I hear an expression as if a crime that these men whom your worships are about to try for a misdemeanor are charged with that?" And continuing in a low and solemn, heavy tone, "for preaching the gospel of the Son of God?" Pausing amidst the most profound silence and breathless astonishment of his hearers, he slowly waved the papers 3 times around his head, then lifted up his hands and eyes to heaven. With extraordinary impressive energy, he exclaimed, "Great God!" The exclamation, the action, the burst of feeling from the audience were all overpowering. Mr. Henry resumed, "May it please your worships, in a day like this, when truth is about to burst her fetters, when mankind are about to be raised to claim their natural and inalienable rights, when the yoke of oppression which has reached the wilderness of America, and the unnatural alliance of ecclesiastical and civil power is about to be dissevered. At such a period, when liberty of conscience, is about to awake from her slumbering and inquire into the reason of such charges as I find exhibited here today in this indictment." Another fearful pause, while the speaker alternately cast his sharp, piercing eyes on the court and the prisoners, and resumed, "If I am not deceived, according to the contents of the paper I now hold in my hand, these men are accused of preaching the gospel of the Son of God? Great God!" Another long pause, during which he again waved the indictment about his head, while a deeper impression was made on the auditory. Resuming his speech, "May it please your worships, there are periods in history of man when corruption and depravity have so long debased the human character that men sink under the weight of the oppressor's hand and become his servile, his abject slave. He licks the hand that smites him. He bows in passive obedience to the mandates of a despot. And in the state of servility, he receives his fetters of perpetual bondage. But may it please your worships, such a day has passed away. From the period when our fathers left the land of their nativity for a settlement in these American wilds, for liberty, for civil and religious liberty, for liberty of conscience, to worship their Creator according to their conception of heaven's revealed will. From the moment they placed their feet on the American continent and in the deeply embedded forest, sought an asylum from persecution and tyranny, from the moment despotism was crushed, her fetters of darkness were broken, and heaven decreed that man should be free to worship God according to the Bible. Were it not for this, in vain have been the efforts and sacrifices of the colonists. In vain were all their sufferings and bloodshed to subjugate this new world. If we, their offspring, must still be oppressed and persecuted. But may it please your worships, permit me to inquire once more, for what are these men about to be tried? The paper says for preaching the gospel of the Son of God. Great God, for preaching the Savior to Adam's fallen race. After another pause and tones of thunder, he inquired, what law have they violated? Then for the third time, in a slow and dignified manner, he lifted his eyes to heaven, waved the indictment around his head. The court and the audience were now wrought up to the most intense pitch of excitement. The face of the prosecuting attorney was pale and ghastly, and he appeared unconscious, that his whole frame were agitated with alarm. And the judge, in a tremulous voice, put an end to the scene by becoming extremely painful by the authoritative command, "Sheriff, discharge those men." That's great. That's great. I love that. But you can tell just in Patrick Henry that these ideas of religious liberty, liberty of conscience, these are taking hold, and people are convinced that this is what we need, and the state and the church need to be separate, and that just needs to be the thing here in this country. And so, as a result, those men were released. The Baptists, noting back here on page 2, the Baptists supported the Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress assembled September 5th, 1774. Baptists were among the first to support it and declared it to be the Supreme Court of the colonies. And then it was the Second Continental Congress that voted and chose to declare independence. October 7th, 1780, a mostly Baptist group remembered as the Overmountain Men defeated the British force at Kings Mountain. And they were from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and what would later be Tennessee. These walked almost nonstop for over 11 days to the battle. Now, why did they do this? So there was a General Ferguson who was leading his troops into the South, and he declared to these people that if you don't tuck tail and run, we're going to come into your towns, we're going to burn your houses, rape your women, and kill your children. That was the threat. And so all these Baptists grabbed their pitchforks and their knives, and they went 11 days, many of them barefoot, and they climbed this mountain, which was very steep, and in the middle of the night, they overtook this entire regiment of Ferguson. Untrained men. In response to the impudent threat, frontiersmen from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, later became Tennessee, joined forces to attack the British Army. Ferguson retreated to Kings Mountain and camped atop and steep slopes, some 1.5 miles from the North Carolina border. In a brilliant four-pronged attack, the undisciplined, untrained militia captured the mountain while inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. Ferguson was killed. The victory was all the more remarkable because the military force had proceeded without the leadership or guidance of the state or the Continental Line. And so I think Ferguson had a troop, I think it was 500 men from this militia. They took on a platoon of 1,100 men, killed or wounded 400 of them, and took the rest of them prisoner. They were mad. These were men's men, is what these were. During the war, General George Washington had Baptist pastor John Gano as his chaplain. Later said Baptist chaplains were among the most prominent and useful in the army, and Washington would later be baptized by Gano at Valley Forge. So, 1783 is when the war ends, the Revolutionary War ends. Remember, 1776, we declare our independence from England, which brings them to our shores for war because they don't want to lose us. 1783, the war ends. 1788, the Constitution of the United States is ratified. And now in between that, there's time that passes, a year, in which there's no Bill of Rights. Okay? Now, just before the Constitution passes, the colonies, all 13 colonies, have to agree, have to vote in favor of the Constitution. Because up to this point, they've had the Articles of Confederation to govern them, which issued a republic, which established a republic, but the republics were small local republics that permitted very much a majority rule. So if the majority decided anything, then they were actually enabled to overpower the rights of the minority. So something had to be done. We need to better equip ourselves. We need to establish a better government. They're convinced a republic is the best, but we need to make it better so we don't fall into the same problem that the Roman Republic had back in the early centuries. So they're wanting to pass the Constitution. So this brings us now to John Leland and the Bill of Rights. So the liberties granted to us by the Bill of Rights is to be largely credited to the influence of Baptist pastor and evangelist John Leland. Leland was born in May 1754 in Grafton, Massachusetts. He was later called the Apostle of Religious and Political Liberty. He was converted in 1774 at the age of 20, traveled to Virginia because he felt that God had called him there to preach, battle the state church, and to establish religious liberty. He preached 3,009 sermons, baptized 700 persons, formed 2 large churches, one of 300 and one of 200. In addition to this, he traveled about 75,000 miles in itinerant ministry, itinerant evangelism. Now that's a lot. That's more than the Apostle Paul did. And it's a lot. And this is on horseback. That says a lot about the guy. Leland defined liberty of conscience thusly: I mean the inalienable right that each individual has of worshiping his God according to the dictates of his conscience, without being prohibited, directed, or controlled therein by human law, either in time, place, or manner. So, Leland had an influence in securing the Bill of Rights. The Constitution did not guarantee an individual right of liberty of conscience. Therefore, Leland could not endorse it, or Madison as a delegate to the Virginia Constitutional Convention. So the other states, so what you have is you have the other colonies are good. You got 12 out of 13, but you have to have all 13, otherwise they're not going to pass it. Well, the Baptists of Virginia by this point has become largely Baptist. And the Baptists of Virginia are concerned, we remember some of that stuff before the war that was going on. We want to make sure that we're not exchanging one tyrant 5,000 miles away for 5,000 tyrants 1 mile away. We want some rights here. We want to make sure that our God-given rights, that the government is not going to impinge upon our rights, that we're going to have liberty of conscience, that we don't have to worry about militia or soldiers coming in and just barging into our house. We don't want anybody taking our arms away from us. We want to make sure that we can defend ourselves, that we can defend our property, our families. What are you going to do about that? And so Madison, as a representative of Virginia, he wants the thing to pass, but he can't pass it without the vote of the people. And the Baptists controlled the vote at that time. And so he and Leland have a meeting, and he promises Leland, look, if you guys will vote yes on this change to the Constitution, then it will be my first act afterwards to present a Bill of Rights. And so, looking down here, middle of the paragraph, Leland held such sway among the Baptists of Virginia that Madison became concerned about his political future. After hearing Leland's reasons, he agreed and promised to introduce it to the U.S. Congress if he could secure the Baptist vote, and that's exactly what happened. Now, Leland also stumped for Thomas Jefferson in his run for the 1801 presidency. And to show their gratitude and love for Jefferson, this is talking about the Baptist, as a friend of liberty, one day all the milk from 900 local loyal Republican cows was collected and brought to Cheshire, where the population gathered to sing hymns, socialize, and make cheese. They produced a wheel of cheese 4 feet, 4.5 inches across, 15 inches thick, and weighing 1,235 pounds. Leland and some others delivered it to Jefferson in D.C. and became another part of history as the original big cheese. So that's where that expression comes from. Leland went on to his reward at the age of 67. His epitaph reads, "Here lies the body of John Leland, who labored 67 years to promote piety and vindicate the civil and religious rights of all men." All right. Any questions, thoughts, comments, concern about that? All right. Go ahead and